Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Dimitri Johnson, and you're listening to MMALatestNews.com.
It's time to roll, baby.
This is Knows MMA.
UFC 241 had its fair share of action from the beginning of the card right on down to the main event. And although it was Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic headlining that night, UFC 241 was the Nate Diaz show. Coming out after almost 3 years off and seemingly not losing a single step, Diaz went out there and put on a fantastic performance with the win over Anthony Pettis. He even did the unthinkable when at one point initiated the ground game in an attempt to utilize the elite level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu he has. It was remarkable to see because in the past, despite having the grappling advantage, Diaz just straight up refused to try to play the ground game just based off of the principle of not avoiding a fist fight. He stole the show last Saturday, and it's not the least bit surprising. Both Nick and Nate Diaz have long been considered the most polarizing figures in this sport, and in Nate's last 3 fights, because of the in-cage performances followed up with how he handled himself outside of the cage, he has just been upping the ante of his profile ever since, and he's now at an all-time high in his career. For the fans that have been following this sport for a long time, seeing Nate Diaz being one of the biggest names in the game right now, after almost 10 years of not getting his proper due and living in the shadow of his older brother before getting that first McGregor fight, it's a true feel-good story. So it was especially cool to see Nate call out fellow veteran of the game, Jorge Masvidal, after the win over Pettis. It's a very rare occurrence to see Diaz address any other fighter in his crosshairs in a respectful manner. The fact that he was complimentary to Masvidal made the call-out all the more intriguing. So now all the talk is surrounding a Nate Diaz-Jorge Masvidal fight. It's interesting because there are a lot of similarities in these two guys' careers. Two veterans that are still relatively young with a lot of runway left, having been respected competitors throughout their career, but just never getting the spotlight until very long periods of time in the game. And now they're both here after all of these years on the cusp of a gigantic fight. One absolutely nobody could have predicted would have been such a major event. But here we are. The Athletic's Chuck Mindenhall tweeted something out after this fight that really summed up my feelings on the contest. Mindenhall tweeted that his problem with Masvidal versus Nate is that he likes to keep his cult figures away from each other. It's a funny way of putting things, and I have to imagine it was meant as a joke to a certain degree, but for me, that's exactly how I feel about this fight. I absolutely love the fact that both Masvidal and Diaz are at this point in their careers right now, after plugging away in the game for a very long time. These two guys are beloved by the MMA fan base for being as authentic as it gets. There are no bullshit personas here. Two of the realest figures in the game have risen to the top at a time when the vast majority of the roster is spending their time crafting and pushing pro wrestling antics down our throat. It's refreshing that these two guys are at the height of their careers. And while I really liked that Nate used his time on the mic to put attention on Masvidal, a part of me was wishing that they wouldn't fight each other. Welterweight is an interesting place right now, and there are a number of different ways to configure the matchmaking such that these two guys can line up great and interesting fights without one of them having to get knocked down from the pedestal. But the more I think about this Diaz versus Masvidal fight, the more I start to realize that this is the fight. With Masvidal coming off of the fastest knockout in the UFC history and quite possibly the most dramatic KO the promotion's ever seen, and Diaz coming back after an extended period of time, only to prove to the world that he hasn't lost a single step, the idea of these two beloved fighters facing off against each other is starting to make more sense. While I never liked the idea of strategic matchmaking in an attempt to dictate the narrative, there were times I felt like going about things this way made some sort of sense. In this case, keeping these two apart is the last thing to do. While we may not want to see either guy have to go down a notch after taking an L, the combination of Diaz and Masvidal's fanfare will be a powerful, powerful thing. Whoever comes out of that fight with the win will have their spotlight shine brighter than ever before because of the circumstances. I think Diaz realized this, and it's this very fact that brought him to the respectful call out of Masvidal. A refreshing and cool thing to see out of the Stockton native. A couple of the fight game's realest ones getting the shine they earned and rightfully deserve.